I think you'll find what Dr. Cocker has to say enlightening and stimulating, and everybody should do real well here tonight. So, Dr. Cocker.
Thanks. So I appreciate the introduction. Father Mark did mention that he taught a course at Loras called Christian Sexual Morality, but the course bulletin didn't print the whole title, so it cut it off at Christian Sex. 2 sections, and they were the first 2 sections to fill up every single one. So we still haven't replaced the hole when he left. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight. They say you shouldn't talk about religion and politics. I love to talk about both of them, especially together. So I thought I would just offer some reflections generally on Catholics and politics, starting with kind of some of the facts, some of the voting patterns, how Catholics actually vote, behave politically, and then turn to the more charged question of how Catholics should vote, the voting dilemmas Catholics often face, and how to kind of think through those. But I'll also then save plenty of time for questions, reaction, discussions, sort of see what's on your mind as we approach this election. And Father Mark's right, 4 years ago, we never would have thought, we knew we were going to have an election in 4 years, but we never would have thought it would be as unique, perhaps, as this election has become. So first of all, the way Catholics actually do vote, because it's kind of an interesting story. The classic image of Catholics 75 years ago, 100 years ago, was loyal Democratic voters. Immigrant voters, part of the New Deal coalition with Roosevelt, and then in the 70s and 80s, Catholics starting to drift away from the Democratic Party, and many of them embracing the Republican Party based on things like abortion, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, things like that. There's a lot of truth to this. It's a little more complicated than that in some ways. For one thing, Catholics were never as overwhelmingly Democratic as we often think when we think back to the great political machines in Boston or New York. Many Catholics were intensely loyal Democrats. Partly that has to do with race and ethnicity more than religion. When many Catholic immigrant groups arrived on the East Coast of the United States, Republicans were the dominant party. The Democratic Party saw an opportunity to boost their numbers, so they welcomed in groups like the Irish, made them citizens, signed them up to vote, and turned them out, and eventually were able to gain power that way. But even when the Italians arrived in places like Boston and New York, the Irish Catholics had locked up all the political positions and didn't want to share power, so the Italians became Republicans, which is why you have in New York even today someone with an Irish name is more likely to be a Democrat, and someone with an Italian name like Rudolph Giuliani is more likely to be a Republican. It's less to do with the Catholic and more to do with our party system, ethnic coalitions, when people arrived, how they were incorporated, and things like that. Even though as we get into the middle of the 20th century, we tend to think of the high water mark of the Catholic vote as when Kennedy, the first successful Catholic to win the presidency, he got something like 90% of the Catholic vote. But the election before that, Eisenhower had actually won the Catholic vote as a Republican. So in the 1950s, plenty of Catholics were voting for Republicans. And in fact, the move away from the Democratic Party by many Catholics had started in the 60s, especially as Catholics, second or third generation away from immigrants, became more affluent. They moved to the suburbs. They started voting for reasons lots of people vote, not ethnic loyalty. Some became Republicans. The biggest factor that people who study this have found is the biggest shift of Catholics away from the Democratic Party happened the same time white Americans generally started moving away from the Democratic Party, and that's the Civil Rights Movement. So no Democratic president has won the white vote since the Civil Rights Movement. White Americans, for whatever reason, moved away from the Democratic Party. Many Catholics were in that group. Abortion did have a significant effect, these other sort of cultural trends from the 60s and 70s, but a lot of the shift of Catholics away from Democratic loyalty was actually already happening for sort of other sorts of reasons, not connected to Catholicism, but to other parts of the lives that Catholics lead. Today, the image is Catholics as a swing vote, because they tend to be in the middle now. They tend to split their vote between Democrats and Republicans. That indicates you might be a key voting bloc. If we can get the Catholic vote, then we'll win. And it's the case that Catholics have voted for the winner, the popular vote winner of every election for the last several elections. So it looks like Catholics are the classic swing vote. The reality, however, is that, I don't know how many of you noticed I don't have an earlobe. Certain people, some people are feeling their ears right now. Certain people don't have earlobes. We're a minority, but we're out there. If I told you that the people without earlobes have voted for the winner in every presidential election, you'd say, wow, maybe we're a key swing vote, right? Or people with eyeglasses, or people who are left-hand. There's lots of groups that vote for the winner in every presidential election, mainly because they're not distinctive. They vote the same way everyone does. Catholics have essentially become that kind of voting bloc. The reason Catholics tend to vote for the winner in every election is Catholics are an excellent cross-section of the American public. So Catholics don't actually vote as a bloc the way, say, Jews or Mormons, smaller religious groups vote as a bloc. Catholics tend not to vote as an identifiable bloc. In fact, the most interesting about Catholic voting patterns is the subgroups. So older Catholics, for example, tend to be more Republican. Younger Catholics tend to be more Democratic. Male Catholics, especially single males, tend to be more Republican. Women, especially single women, more Democratic. White Catholics vote Republican. Latino, African American, and Asian Catholics tend to vote Democratic. Catholics who go to church more frequently lean Republican. Catholics who go to church less frequently lean Democratic. Wealthier Catholics vote Republican. Working class Catholics vote Democratic. We basically break down the same way that the rest of the country breaks down. So when you look at the Catholic vote, there really isn't anything distinctively Catholic about it, which is kind of a problem because the church, the bishops, spend an awful lot of time and energy trying to sort of guide the conscience of Catholic voters when it comes to what principles to vote on, what issues to take into account. All the evidence is that the vast majority of Catholics pay absolutely no attention to Catholic teaching when it comes to the way they vote. There's no evidence that priests we have here, that what priests say makes any difference to how Catholics vote. There's no evidence that Catholics even know when the bishops make a statement. And those Catholics those like 6% of Catholics who have heard of statements like faithful citizenship, which the bishops put out every 4 years, most of them ignore it. So there's really no evidence that Catholics as a whole are a distinctive voting bloc that vote a certain way in response to cues from church leadership. Now, that's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of Catholics who do try and do this. It's just we're a shrinking minority, probably overrepresented in this room. The fact that you're here tonight means you're probably not like typical Catholic, that there's a higher percentage of you perhaps that would like to apply your faith to your citizenship or your voting decisions in a way, in an authentic way. But know that if that's true of you, you're in the minority of Catholics nationwide who don't pay much attention at all to their religion when they vote. The dilemma often is that, well, first of all, start with the basic teaching of the church is that you do, as Catholics, have an obligation to participate in the political system. So there are certain religious groups, some Christian group, Protestant groups in particular, that emphasize sort of withdraw from the world. Keep your eye on heaven. The Catholic Church has always said, no, we're a pilgrim people heading towards the city of God, but we're also living in the earthly city, and we should try and make the earthly city as just and humane a place as possible. So we do have an obligation to participate in the political system. Normally speaking, that means voting. So the U.S. bishops, for example, emphasize the obligation to vote, but it's not an absolute obligation. They're also clear that if you cannot, in good conscience, vote for any candidate, that's an acceptable choice. As long as it's not based on apathy or not caring, as long as it's a real crisis of conscience, I cannot vote, you're under no obligation. As a church, we're about to canonize Dorothy Day, who went to prison early in her life advocating for the right of women to vote. Once women got the right to vote, she never voted in an election. She said, I can't participate in a corrupt system. Instead, I will try and change the world by engaging the poor directly, setting up houses of hospitality, all those kinds of things. So as long as you're trying in some way to participate and make the community better, you don't have an absolute obligation to vote. Now, voting in a democracy is the basic way we register our political participation. So for most of us, voting is one of those acts. But if you can, in good conscience, vote, don't worry, you're okay, according to Orthodox Catholic teaching in that regard. The problem when it comes to voting, of course, as many of you know, as the church tells us we should, as we think about voting, think about first some core Catholic principles Catholic social teaching. So these are things like the sanctity and dignity of human life, solidarity, which is dedication to the common good, the good of all, subsidiarity, which emphasizes civil society and smaller groups like families and parishes and smaller neighborhood groups. The preferential option for the poor, so we should ask, does a policy not just not hurt the poor, but we should put the poor first whenever we're thinking about whether a policy is good or bad. The poor come first in our minds. The rights and dignity of workers, safe working conditions, a living wage, the right to form trade unions and collectively bargain, the global solidarity, peace, development, and most recently a big emphasis on stewardship, protecting God's creation, our environment, things like that. So these are some general principles. Based on those, the church then also goes the next level down and says there are specific issues that come up because of these principles. If we're going to try and apply these principles, we have to pay attention to specific issues. And you know there's a long list. Abortion is up there, the death penalty, immigration, physician-assisted suicide, poverty, war, religious liberty, again, the rights of workers to form unions. There's a whole list of issues that the church says, because we believe these principles, these issues we should take seriously and weigh in when we make our voting choices. Again, I don't have to tell many of you, the dilemma for many Americans is we live in a two-party system. Most other democracies have a multi-party system. There's more choices on the menu than just the two when we open it. But in our two-party system, the way issues usually line up on a left-right, liberal-conservative spectrum doesn't map very well with Catholic social teaching. Those issues I just listed, some of them seem to be very liberal, some very conservative. Some Democratic candidates usually embrace, and others Republican candidates usually embrace. So it's very hard for Catholics to consistently embrace these issues that our bishops and our leaders tell us matter, when it seems some candidates are always going to embrace some and not others. So many Catholics feel a sense of homelessness, that I'm never going to be able to vote for a consistent Catholic when it comes to these issues, which sort of creates dilemmas. Again, for most Catholics, this ain't a dilemma at all. They already would have left the room. They're like, I'm not interested in this stuff to begin with. But for a lot of Catholics, this is sort of a serious kind of dilemma. How do I square Catholic teaching with the fact that I have to make these hard choices? There's usually two things that come up for Catholics at this point. The first is, how do I weigh these issues then when I make my choice? And is there more room for disagreement on some of these issues than others? The weighing one is probably the biggest one that generates the most passion. The way I like to think of it is, and some of you have heard this before, the way I like to think of it is the way you negotiate your own life. So I'll give you some things that matter to me. Being a good husband to my wife, being a good father to my two sons, being a good teacher to my students, being a good friend to my friends, single malt scotch, the Dallas Cowboys, University of Maryland men's basketball team, and Liverpool FC in the Premier League, British crime novels, I'm into those, and I got to get the gutters cleaned out. That's on my list of things. So all these things are important in my life to some degree. And you all have similar lists. Maybe more interesting, I hope more interesting, but similar lists. If I told you that, you know what, every single one of these matters exactly the same, that I will prioritize them all of them with the exact same weight, you can say, well, you've got your priorities wrong. Clearly some of these should be more important to you than others. Being a good father should be more important than Dallas Cowboys. That if your kids need you, you can't say, well, I'm sorry, I'm watching the game. That's more important. One should definitely be more important in the way you weigh your life than the other. If I also told you, however, that I'm only going to focus on one and ignore all the rest, I'm only going to focus on being a good dad, not only would I freak my kids out with all this hyper attention, but also I'd let other things that really are still important in my life slide. And also, in our own lives, we know that some of these things have underlying connections. So being a good father is more important than single malt scotch. But there have been times when the scotch has helped the father thing, right? They're connected. Being a good husband is more important than cleaning out the gutters, but my wife will tell you there's definitely a connection between those two areas of my life that I need to balance. And the church says a lot of these issues have the same underlying connections. The same reasons we oppose the death penalty and abortion are this underlying dignity and sanctity of human life. There are these sort of underlying organic understanding that all these issues matter, maybe not to the same extent, but they all have their place. Just like your own life, not everything's important, but everything does have its place, and you should account for all these things that matter to you. The other thing that you all know from your life is that circumstances change, right? Some things that matter to you now maybe are different than 5 years ago. I'm very blessed that the two things that matter to me, that my list doesn't include two things, like finding a new job because I just got laid off, or I just got diagnosed with cancer. So when certain things happen in life, our priorities get changed around. Suddenly, something I thought was not very important becomes more important. And things that I really worried about a lot suddenly don't seem so important now that something's happened. That's the same kind of way in life. And circumstances, even day to day. I can tell you this honestly, that in the ranking of things that matter to me, my family matters more than my friends. If it really comes down to it, my family is more important in my life than my friends. But if I just sit down to play a board game with my kids, and a friend calls in an emergency saying, Dave, I need you, there's been this terrible accident, meet me at the hospital, I'm not going to say, well, Donna, you know, family's more important to me than friends, and I just sat down with the kids to play Risk. It's going to be at least 6 hours until I get to the hospital. My family's more important, but sometimes you got to set that aside because there's a real crisis that you need to deal with. Political issues are the same way. If you think about the way we view issues, we need to all weigh them. Not all of them are going to be equal. The church isn't a computer that says, okay, there's 20 issues that matter, it's 12 to 8, so I got to go for the one that agrees on 12. Maybe those 8 are more important than the 12. But also, we also need to know that candidates don't always have the same priorities we do. So just because I might really think climate change is important, I'm on fire from reading Pope Francis on climate change, this is a key issue, just because a candidate checks climate change on the box doesn't mean they're going to do anything once they get into office, right? And the same is true of a lot of these issues. Just because it's my top issue doesn't mean it's the top issue for a candidate. Even if we can know what the candidate's positions are, you all know enough that candidates can be pretty slippery. What their positions are, they need to adjust to the way things, the political environment. Also, think about things like the opposite stake. So if the death penalty is very important to me and I'm opposed to the death penalty, and the church says I should be, if I'm voting for governor in Texas where I grew up, that's a big issue. Texas executes a lot of people, and the governor's a big part of that. But if that governor, say named George W. Bush, runs for president, his enthusiastic support of the death penalty, I'm not going to wait as much. The president has no impact on death penalty policy in the U.S. It's really a state issue. Someone's running for local school board, I don't really care about their position on the Iranian nuclear deal. But for the president, that's a pretty big deal for me. And the same token, how a president feels about evolution, I really don't care. But school board member, that's going to be more important. So think about the office that is being sort of sought and what kind of impact the person will actually have on these issues. And then even things like, in our own life as certain situations change, issues like torture, which the church opposes in all circumstances. In most elections in my lifetime, I haven't had to worry about that. It hasn't even been on the radar screen. But since 9/11, torture has been a legitimate issue that some candidates support it and some don't. And it's been the U.S. policy at some times and not others. So now I have to sort of weigh that in a different way that I didn't have to before. Immigration is another one that sort of comes up and then recedes. Same-sex marriage. People didn't think they had to take same-sex marriage into account in their voting choices 30 years ago. It wasn't even on the radar screen. So there's the way society changes, the way new issues come up. We have to think about how we recalibrate the weighing of these issues. The other way to sort of think, or the other dilemma that often comes up is there more room for disagreement on some of these issues? And there clearly is. Well, I guess if you think about your own life. Parents can disagree all the time about the best way to parent their children, even though they're all good parents and they all love their children. I send my kids to Catholic school. I have friends who are awesome parents who send their kids to public school. I've got friends who are awesome parents who homeschool their kids. We're all good parents. We all want the same thing, what's best for our kids, but we can disagree on the best way to do it in good faith. Now, some things are beyond good parenting. Abusive behavior or abusive parenting, neglect, things like that. You've gone beyond what's a legitimate disagreement on the best way to parent. But in a lot of ways of life, not every musician is a great musician in the best way. There's lots of different ways to be a good musician. There's lots of different ways to be a good teacher. There's probably even lots of different ways to disagree about how to clean out the gutter. Should it be, the ladder reach over, you get on the roof, you reach down, you use a hose. There's lots of different ways we can disagree on the best way to do things. It doesn't mean we're in dissent. But other times, there's actually a gulf that means we fundamentally disagree not on how to accomplish something, but on the thing itself, right? I can disagree with another Scotch drinker about the best kind of Scotch, Highland, Lowland, more smoke, less smoke. But when my wife rejects all Scotch as undrinkable, that's dissent, right? We have a fundamental disagreement. So on some issues, there's clearly more room for disagreement than others. Some things like torture or the death penalty, abortion, the church says, you know what? It's always wrong. There isn't a lot of gray area there. It's just always wrong. But when it comes to things like climate change or how to stop the civil war in Syria, there's an awful lot of different ways to get there, different disagreement on what the best methods to accomplish this. The church is clear that every single American deserves access to basic health care. That's very clear. But there's lots of different ways we can get there. Almost every country that has universal health care has done it a different way. They've all managed to get there, but they have different kind of plans that work in different ways. So some issues, there's more disagreement than others. The key danger, though, is issues, just because an issue has more room for disagreement doesn't mean it's less important. Pope Francis has come out and said climate change is a critical, global, apocalyptic emergency. We as a species have to respond. This is sort of a threat to God's creation. There's a lot of disagreement on the best way to do it, but that doesn't mean it's less important than physician-assisted suicide, which is a legitimate issue as well. It doesn't have a lot of agreement or disagreement. It's basically, it's wrong. We shouldn't have it. It should be illegal. Not as much room for disagreement doesn't mean it's more important. And the other thing is that just because there's room for disagreement doesn't mean it's an excuse to ignore it. Oftentimes, if there's an issue where, there's various plans to do it, it's a way for me to say, I really don't want to think about it at all. When I say to my wife, yes, I agree we should clean out the gutters, but I'm going to wait till fall's over when all the leaves have fallen, right? That just makes sense. But then I say, it's winter, it's pretty cold out there. I'm going to wait until spring when it's warm. But in spring, it's raining all the time, the roof's slippery, I could kill myself. I'm going to wait till summer. Man, it's hot in the summer, isn't it? I touch the shingles and it's burning. I'm going to wait till fall. Pretty soon she's going to say, this is a legitimate disagreement on the best way to clean the gutters. You just don't want to clean the gutters. You don't want to admit it. And I think as a lot of us as Catholics, we actually disagree with the church's position on an issue. We don't want to admit it, so we just say, everyone can disagree on that. So we're kind of ignore it. The church says every issue matters, not to the same extent, and there's more room for disagreement on some than others, but they all matter. And for me at least, the reality is almost every Catholic would like to see some teaching of the church changed. That often Catholics cannot in good conscience accept every single teaching of the church. We should probably just be honest about that and say, here's where I cannot in good conscience accept Catholic teaching, even though I embrace the tradition and I love the tradition, rather than always trying to weasel our way out of it by saying, that's less important or that doesn't. There's room for disagreement, so I really don't want to talk about it. We should sort of be honest at where we have these disagreements. Just like your own life, there's always this sense that, at least with me, that I'm not always getting the balance exactly right. That, I should have balanced that better. I should have weighed this more heavily than the others. We always get the chance, God gives us a chance to continually try and try again. The nice thing about a democracy is we get to vote all the time. So even if you go in the voting booth and you're uncomfortable with your choices and you're finding it difficulty to choose, there's always the next election to try and get it right again. I'll stop there because there's a lot of you, and I'd rather sort of hear what's on your mind, questions, challenges, things I didn't touch on that you'd like to hear more about. You can just shout them out, and I'll repeat it for the group so everyone can hear.